Good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock in the morning on September 2nd, 2019, and we have started September. It's nice to start September, but the end of the year is coming very soon. And today, we are going to continue the comparison between the iFi Micro iDSD Black Label versus the Chord Mojo. The Mojo, the best sounding amp DAC you can possibly find. I mean, please, could there be anything better? Well, the answer is probably yes. So today, we are going to compare the Black Label versus the Mojo for the bass response. And we have 3 songs we're going to compare. Angel by Massive Attack, Flight from the City by Johan Johansen, and Koto, Koto's Lion, not Koto. Koto is the band, Lion. And what we're looking for is whether one or the other provides better detail and better separation, less distortion in the bass region. From the prior test we did, which was about soundstage and power and all that stuff, I told you that these 2 units sound practically alike. Now let's hone in and try to figure out if the specific frequency ranges, bass, mids, treble, have any distinguishing characteristics between the 2 if we are focusing in those regions. So let's start off with the A/B test, and at the bottom of the play screen at the bottom of the video, there's going to be a designation where we start each song, A and then B, and then you can skip back and forth. A is going to be the iFi, and B will be the Mojo. So let's start. We have the test playlist going. No, go away. Thank you. And we're going to start with Angel by Massive Attack. I have the A/B switch plugged in. The iFi is connected at 10 o'clock volume, which is matched to approximately double orange on the Mojo. It's so nice talking about volume in colors, you know? It doesn't mean you're crazy at all. And we are using the Allo Audio S4R closed back reference class headphones. And these are true reference class headphones. So let's go. That low rumble starts up fairly quietly, and then it ramps up. There's no distortion yet. That low rumble is really well controlled. It's not interfering with the second bass that's in the mixer at this point. That second bass is a deeper drum, and then there's a third bass, which is a much more small drum. It has a faster resonance to it. And then you also have a quieter cymbal that's playing mostly in the right ear cup. That rumble, it doesn't seem to be interfering with any portion of the mix at this point. Now you have some horn instruments playing. Clear differentiation between the low rumble bass and the horn. I'm going to increase the volume to about noon. And at noon, this is exceptionally loud. The vocal is coming in. Very good separation between that low rumble and the vocalist. There doesn't seem to be any mixing or melding of the frequencies. I'm going to bring it back down to about 10 o'clock. I'm going to skip ahead to about halfway of the song. And now we have the faster drum playing. That low rumble is in the background. It's not interfering at all with that faster drum. It's not interfering with the vocalist at this juncture. It's a good representation of that low rumble because sometimes what happens is, depending on the headphone and the DAC that you have or the amplifier, that rumble becomes overpowering and it starts distorting the rest of the mix. And I can say without any doubt that the iFi has controlled that low rumble significantly. Now, I have not used the bass boost on this. I'm just using it at flat setting, okay? The Mojo doesn't come with any bass boost, so I don't think it would be altogether fair to start, playing with the filters where the Mojo doesn't have the filters if we're doing an A and B comparison. I just want to do flat versus, whatever the Mojo is tuned for. So it's a very nice kind of unobtrusive rumble presentation, especially with the S4Rs, which don't emphasize the bass frequency. Now, let us switch to the Mojo. And I have the Mojo here somewhere. There we go. We're switching on the Mojo, switching on the AB, and let's start. The volume is at double orange, as I said, which is about equal volume to 10 o'clock on the iFi. I would say that the rumble is presented fairly the same way as it was in the iFi at this point in the song. I'm going to increase the volume a little bit. And now I'm at double yellow. Good separation between the low rumble, the mid bass, and then the faster drum, and the cymbal. The cymbal seems quieter than it did on the iFi, and I'll increase the volume again. Now we're at double green. The cymbal just sounds really muted compared to the iFi, where the iFi provided the cymbal much more forward, a little bit more full. The Mojo takes that cymbal and kind of sounds like it's muffled. The vocal is now in the mix. Very smooth. I would say that the vocal is probably a little less forward than it was on the iFi. The iFi had the vocal a bit ahead of the other instruments in the mix. The Mojo has it pretty much shoulder to shoulder, and that starts to take away from the emphasis of the vocalist. It starts melding the voice just a tad. Let's skip to halfway. Now we have the low rumble and the bass. I can't say that there's a hard separation between the low rumble and the bass as there seemed to be on the iFi. It's just a slight melding of the two. And on top of that, when the vocalist is singing, it's shoulder to shoulder, not quite separated enough as it was on the iFi. No peakiness, but there's also seems to be a little bit of lack of energy at the top range. Whereas on the iFi, you could get a little bit of that treble energy, although it didn't become ear piercing. Okay, so here's what I'm hearing. I think that doing the A/B test, the iFi has a more forward presentation and better separation of all the instruments, including the vocalist. When the vocalist started singing, he sounded clearer, just I think noticeably to me doing that A/B test, he sounded clearer because his frequency wasn't being melded into the bass frequency as it is on the Mojo. Moreover, what happens is that there's a hard separation between the three bass instruments. And I hear three, there might be additional ones, but right now I only hear three. That low rumble, then there's that middle sounding bass drum, and then there's a faster resolving drum that's playing. Then you have the cymbal. Now, when the cymbal came in on the iFi, that cymbal was very distinct, and it was... You could say maybe it was emphasized. You could say that it was neutral. I don't know how to present it, other than to say that it seemed to be its own character and it seemed to be a hard separation on the iFi, whereas on the Mojo, it simply didn't give me that separation. It melded too much. And on top of that, when the vocalist was singing with the entire mix on the Mojo, he sounded shoulder to shoulder with all of the other instruments, which kind of blended his voice and made it a little bit harder to pick out what he was saying. Whereas on the iFi, it was easier to pick him out because he seemed at least a step, maybe two steps ahead of the mix. So there's that kind of maybe a boost in the mid range. Perhaps that's what you could say. Whereas on the Mojo, it just emphasizes the warmth and the blending of the frequency. And I'm probably mincing words. I'm probably trying to nitpick and find differences, but this is something that may be of some significance to people. Even though they sound very much alike, there's still that distinctive characteristic that the iFi has the Mojo simply doesn't provide. It has this gloss, the Mojo does. that may or may not be pleasant depending on your taste and the song and your particular headphone that you're using. Okay, so now let's go to Flight from the City, and we are going to switch to the iFi. Okay, we are now on the iFi, and we're going to start Flight from the City. We are still at about 10 o'clock in volume. That piano sounds very clear. There's a slight reverberation to that piano key, but it doesn't sound distorted at all. In fact, I would say it sounds like you're sitting in a medium-sized room, probably 3 or 4 rows back from the stage, listening to this piano. It doesn't sound muffled. Very, I would say, authentic, and that's a particularly amorphous term to use. But imagine that you have this piano, and it's a grand piano, and it's playing. There's just kind of just a resonance to the piano keys as the pianist is hitting down on them. And that resonance just carries slightly until the next key is hit. And then, it kind of builds on itself. You have that kind of rumbly nature present at the bottom of the register. And that's what's happening, but it's not distorting anything. I hear the sizzle in the background, and the sizzle is not overemphasized. It's just a detail somewhere back there. I hear the string instruments, the cello, and it's very soft and smooth. I would say that there's a little bit of a melding between the piano and the cello frequency. There's not a significant amount of separation, but you can hear one and you can hear the other easily. So the piano frequency is not distorting the cello or the string instruments in any way that I can tell. Okay, now let's stop and let's go to the Mojo. Okay, switch to the Mojo, and let's start again. And I've kept the volume at double green, which is a little bit louder than 10 o'clock on the iFi. So I'll bring it down just a little bit. Now we're at double yellow. That seems to be approximately the same volume. The piano sounds a bit heavier on the Mojo. There's that resonance that just has a bit of a boost to it. Whether or not it's distorting anything, I'm really listening for. And I would say it is. I think that there is a slight distortion to the piano, whereas on the iFi, when the piano is hit, when the piano keys are being played, that resonance doesn't seem to interfere with anything. It just keeps resolving and it keeps going. It's a quicker degradation of that frequency, of that reverberation, whereas with the Mojo, it just tends to linger a little bit longer, and it has a weird kind of noise to it, kind of graininess because of that extra lingering. It doesn't sound as open and airy as the iFi. Now, the iFi didn't make the piano sound open and airy. I'm not saying that it's an airy piano with the iFi. It's just that in comparison between the two, the Mojo simply presents the piano heavier and almost like there's something covering the piano to present it a bit more muffled than on the iFi. And that distortion frequency in the background, that buzzing, the electrical buzz thing in the background, is a little harder to pick out on the Mojo than it was on the iFi. On the iFi, when there was just a bit of silence or it's just the piano, I can hear the buzzing, but I can't hear it all that clearly on the Mojo. The string instruments sound about the same, I would say. There's still that melding, so the two devices do meld the piano with the string instruments, but the piano on the Mojo is overemphasized over the string instruments. and the piano takes front and center, and the strings are somewhere in the background, and a little bit harder to resolve. Whereas on the iFi, both were playing and both seemed to have an equal presence in the mix. You could hear the piano clearly, and then you could hear the string instruments clearly. On the Mojo, it seems to meld the frequencies a bit too much, and then the piano is boosted so that the piano overpowers the string instrument when they're playing together. So in this particular song, what tends to appear to me is that the iFi has slightly better resolution, slightly better separation of the instruments, and the piano doesn't sound as beefy, and it doesn't sound as overpowered, and it also doesn't sound as muffled as it does on the Mojo. You know, are we talking about huge differences between the two? No, I wouldn't say it's a giant difference, but it's a noticeable difference if you do an A and B test. And if you're looking for something specific, one between these two, if your preference is to try to find the separation of instruments, and you definitely want to pick one of these two units, I would submit that the iFi is the better of the two options for that purpose alone. That the separation is cleaner and clearer on the iFi, and on top of that, the bass is not boosted like it is on the Mojo. Even though they sound warm, they have a kind of a very similar characteristic. The Mojo just has this heaviness to it, imparting this clumsy and muffled sound signature to anything that has a bit of bass to it, and it just kind of gets weird and distorted. At least in an A/B test. Now, you may really like that sound signature, and you may sit back and say, boy, the Mojo sounds really good on my particular song and my particular headphones. That's great. But for specific use purposes, when you're trying to eke out separation amongst instruments in a song like Flight from the City, I would have to say that the iFi is the better resolving in total than the Mojo. Okay, so now let us go to Koto, and we're going to switch back to the iFi. Okay, we're back on iFi, and we're going to start Lion by Koto. So there's a big rumbly bass that's playing right now, and then there's a clickety-clackety thing. I don't know what it is. I think it's probably some sort of bell instrument or steel instrument that's being hit by drumsticks. And then you have a faster resolving drum right now. Very quick resonance. It comes and it goes. I'm going to increase the volume to about 11 o'clock. Now you have the fast drum, you have a medium drum, both very well separated. Although there's a slight melding of the two frequencies, you can still hear their two characteristics differently. Now you have that big rumbly bass, and you have the vocalist saying hoo-ha, as the rumbly bass is playing. You have the rumbly bass, and then you have the middle bass, kind of a heavier bass than the faster one. And now all the bass drums are playing. You have the rumbly bass, you have the middle bass, and you have the fast resolving bass. I can clearly hear the fast resolving bass. I can hear the mid bass. And I'm not hearing the big rumbly bass right now. It may not be playing. Now it's that big rumbly bass. Like I said, the big rumbly bass is melding the tonality of the vocalist just a little bit, but you can still hear their separate voices or separate frequencies. Okay, so now let's switch to the Mojo. Okay, we are now on the Mojo, and let's start again. That big bass drum sounds much more boosted, so there's more emphasis on there than it was on the iFi. The iFi had slightly leaner presentation to it. That's clear to me. The faster drum sounds a bit more muffled on the Mojo, whereas on the iFi it was a little bit more airy. Now you have that middle drum with the faster resolving drum. You can hear the separation, but again, that middle drum sounds a bit muffled. Your big bass drum is back. You have the faster drum and the bass drum, the big bass drum. I would say the tonality of the vocalist seems to be about the same between the two, about similar type of melding. Not a huge difference. Yeah, I wouldn't say that on this type of song that there's a big difference between the two. In fact, what I would probably say is that they're very, very similar to each other. The only difference that I found is that the Mojo presents that big rumbly bass a little bit more boosted than on the iFi. The iFi has a bit more air to that rumbly bass, a little bit better resolution to it than the Mojo. And by resolution, I mean it doesn't sound as rumbly and kind of muddled. But it's a slight difference. It's not a huge difference. Okay, so let's talk about conclusions. I think for the bass, these two are very, very similar. They have a warm presentation. They don't get peaky. They don't really... they don't take well to presenting vocalists as clearly separated and airy as in other DACs, for example, like the Cobalt. And that may be of benefit to you if you're the type of person that likes a warmer sound signature, something that's a little bit more closed off, something that has a bit more intimacy, then both of these would probably suit your needs. But if you're looking for a unit between the two that has a bit more separation and the ability to resolve separate instruments a little bit cleaner and clearer, then the iFi has to be the one that wins that battle. It does provide slightly better separation of multiple instruments playing, depending on what the instrument is, and it has a bit of air to the entire frequency range that the Mojo simply does not present. It doesn't matter which song you're playing, the iFi simply has a slightly leaner presentation to it in the bass frequency than the Mojo. The Mojo just sounds heavy and thick and like really thick maple syrup. Whereas the iFi is maple syrup, but you've added a little bit of water to it, so it's not as thick. And ultimately, you have to audition both of these back to back. If you're stuck between the two and you really don't know, you have to audition both of these two back to back in order to determine which one is to your liking. And if you can't choose, and if you don't have the ability to audition both, then the question for you should be, what type of sound signature do you prefer? Do you want that additional, slightly more separation of the instruments and not as thick bass? Or do you prefer to have just all thick bass and you want melding of frequencies? And that's something that you're going to have to ask yourself. I mean, what does your current setup give you? And does it provide that thick bass? And if it already provides that thick bass, then maybe buying the Mojo is not all that unique. Perhaps you may want something that has a thick bass, but also a little bit of air like the iFi. All right, I hope that this has been of some help. I hope that if you have any questions or you have any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm currently on Patreon. If you would like to contribute to my channel on Patreon, giving me a couple of bucks a month would help me go a long way. I have people asking me every day to review products that I don't own, and so I have to, acquiesce at some point and purchase those products. And so any little bit amount of money, of your hard-earned money that you can see fit to give to me, I would truly appreciate it. I thank all of my subscribers, all of my viewers, and all of my patrons so far for contributing and being a part of this growing yet small community. Thank you so much, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day.